for this evening. Thank you. Oral questions put by members to ministers. The time now is 2:56, and I will now recognize the Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today we learned from the Conservative Government of Newfoundland and Labrador that the costs associated with Muskrat Falls project have changed dramatically. Mr. Speaker, projections for the cost of this project have gone up to $7.4 billion from $6.2 billion. My question to the Premier, will the ratepayers of Nova Scotia be paying more for this renewable energy project?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, if the Leader of the Opposition doesn't know this, he should know that under federal greenhouse gas regulations, 6 of the 8 generating plants in Nova Scotia will have to close between 2014 and 2030, or 2016 and 2030. So over 14 years, 6 of those will have to be replaced. The question before us is, what is the most cost-effective way to replace that generation? And the answer to that is, Mr. Speaker, the Muskrat Falls project.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, that wasn't the question. The question is, will Nova Scotians be paying more for this renewable energy project? Mr. Speaker, the Premier has signed on to a deal that has no escape clause. It has a 35-year financial investment from Nova Scotians on infrastructure that, Mr. Speaker, we won't own. And the Premier can't even tell us what the actual cost of this will be, that what Nova Scotians' share of that project will be. So my question to the Premier, can the Premier finally tell us what the price per kilowatt will be when this renewable energy project reaches Nova Scotia families?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition should know, if he doesn't, that the electricity in this province is generated through Nova Scotia Power. They're a private company. The project is a private project. The capital invested will be private, and they will file the cost of the Maritime Link between the Utility and Review Board. And I'm surprised if the Leader of the Opposition in this province doesn't even understand how these projects are priced.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, what I understand is anytime big business see the Premier coming, he's left with no clothes, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, big business knows Nova Scotians open for business, and the Premier is willing to sign a check and let them fill in the amount at a later date, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Premier can't tell us what this project's going to cost per kilowatt. Mr. Speaker, we learned that the portion that Newfoundland and Labrador is responsible for is going up $1.2 billion. And we also learned today, Mr. Speaker, that the Emera portion is under review, and escalating costs could be projected on that. So my question to the Premier, how can the Premier commit Nova Scotians to a deal that he doesn't know the cost of and what it'll mean to Nova Scotia families?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, this is just exactly the point. What we know is that Muskrat Falls will be the lowest cost option. We know that the Leader of the Opposition and the Liberal Party of Nova Scotia are proposing to deregulate the electricity market, increase the cost of power to consumers by 30 to 50%, exactly what happened in the other jurisdictions. The Leader of the Opposition himself has said that he would allow people to come into the province and to set up natural gas electricity plants and compete head-to-head. Mr. Speaker, that's deregulation. He's trying to hide from it now, but that's what he said.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's so interesting we have the Premier who wants to have a debate about Muskrat Falls, but it's so obvious that he's already made up his mind, and today we learn he's made up his mind regardless of the cost, because as we now know, the cost has gone from $6.2 billion up another $1.2 billion to $7.4 billion. We also know, Mr. Speaker, that Emera is going to make a 9.2% guaranteed profit on their investment in Muskrat Falls. What we don't know, what the Premier has a duty to tell Nova Scotians is how much are they kicking in. And so although we've asked this question of the Premier 14 times already, it remains the most important question to be answered by this government in this House. How much will that power cost when it gets to our homes and to our businesses?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Conservative Party knows that it is the Conservative government in Ottawa that requires the closure of the 6 of the 8 coal-fired generating plants in this province as a result of greenhouse gas regulations that they have brought in. The question before us is how do we replace that generating capacity and at what cost? And the more you look at the Muskrat Falls project, the more you look at the independent studies they do, the more attractive that project becomes.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier is right about one thing. We should compare Muskrat Falls to all of the available options before us today. Newfoundland has tied their anchor to it because they don't have options that Nova Scotia does. But the Premier has rigged the UARB review to say they must approve Muskrat Falls, and they must approve it only if it's consistent with his own electricity plans. The URB is not going to tell us how does it compare to natural gas, how does it compare to importing electricity from Quebec, how does it compare to all the other sources of energy we could bring into Nova Scotia. The Premier will not let the URB look at those options. He's rigged the review because he's already made up his mind, and he won't even tell us how much the project is going to cost. And so my question to the Premier is this: if he is so confident that Muskrat Falls is the right way forward, will he agree today to allow the URB to review every single option for energy in Nova Scotia, not just the ones that are consistent with his plans?
Hear, hear. Order, please. The word rigged is unparliamentary in many jurisdictions, and I would ask the Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party, everybody retract that, please.
Mr. Speaker, perhaps the word fixed would have been better. Thank you.
Order, please. Order, please. Is also unparliamentary, so I suggest you get the thesaurus out and have a look for another word. I would ask the honourable member, please.
Mr. Speaker, I withdraw those words and replace them with the word limit and constrain and disallow any other options when I ask my question.
Thank you very much. The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Utility and Review Board is free to do just exactly what the Leader of the Opposition has asked, and I believe they will.
The Honourable Leader of the Progressive Conservative Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia has access to natural gas. Natural gas is clean and it's cheap, but it is not renewable. The Premier has told the URB they must approve his project, the project that he and Emera have together, if it meets his electricity plan, which rules out counting natural gas as a renewable source. That's why he has constrained the URB's ability to do what every Nova Scotian wants done, which is to compare Muskrat Falls to all the alternatives. Today we know not only is it a mega project, it's a super mega project because the cost has gone up to $7.4 billion, of which we are committed, because of the Premier, to 20% of the cost, starting with the Maritime Link, which has already been pointed out is going to go up in cost itself. The Premier won't tell us how much will that energy cost when it comes to our doors, and so I will say once again, if he's so confident that this is right, why not tell the URB to look at every single option available in Nova Scotia and not just ones that fit with his plans?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I just don't know. Either the Leader of the Conservative Party doesn't understand the process, or somebody has given him some wrong information. The Utility and Review Board is free to look at all of the options, to compare them, and to decide what the lowest cost options are for Nova Scotians. We are confident, of course, that it will be the Muskrat Falls project. And you know something, Mr. Speaker? At one point in time, the Leader of the Conservative Party was confident of that too. And I'll just table for you, Mr. Speaker, a couple of things that the Leader of the Conservative Party told the National Press Club. They said that Lower Churchill, he said, it's a great example of what can be done interprovincially in my region of Canada to generate a real, lasting economic activity. He said not only is it good energy policy, it's also a great economic development plan. What has changed?
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Premier. Obviously, we're happy that after saying that a debate on Muskrat Falls was not necessary this summer, he's finally agreed that a debate in this legislature is necessary. You know, Mr. Speaker, as has been pointed out by a number of my colleagues, we now have learned that the base project is $1 billion or so over budget and construction hasn't even begun. The NDP have handled this project poorly from the beginning here in Nova Scotia. They signed a deal without knowing the costs, and the Premier promised it would bring stable energy prices, and I'll table that, and now Amira has said that it'll be 2 to 3% increase every year annually for the life of that contract. Mr. Speaker, if the project is $1 billion over budget now and they haven't begun work, would the Premier tell us how much further over budget he expects the project to be before it begins producing energy?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the project cost estimates were just exactly that. They're estimates. Of course, the result of further engineering work and design work, drilling down in those costs, give us a further example of what those costs are going to be. The question is, as I've said before, is how does it compare to the other options that are in front of us? And those are getting and those comparisons are going to be done by the Utility and Review Board that will ensure that Nova Scotians get the lowest cost option, Mr. Speaker. It is simply the fact that this is as we continue to look at this project, it becomes a better and better option for the people of Nova Scotia, certainly better than the deregulation that is proposed by the Liberal caucus.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, you know, the Premier has said over and over this is the best option and it meets the equivalence agreement. The fact is it may not meet the equivalency agreement now. And, Mr. Speaker, the project, according to the Deputy Minister of Energy, is also behind schedule by at least a year. Mr. Speaker, the government has put all its eggs in one basket. The Premier has all but admitted that today, and now we've also learned that Hydro-Quebec has not agreed to a division of water rights to allow the project to go ahead. And I will table a letter by Hydro-Quebec denying the water rights and the fact that it actually has the access, as well as a letter from lawyers in Newfoundland agreeing to the fact that that is an issue, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, the NDP have guaranteed to the federal government that Churchill Falls will meet the equivalencies, and yet now it looks like it will take a number of years to sort out the water rights to move the project ahead. So, Mr. Speaker, what is the backup plan the Premier has to meet the renewable targets the government is committed to, and what will those backup plans cost ratepayers?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, well, I can tell the member this. It is not deregulation, which is what the Liberals continue to put forward as an option for Nova Scotians, something that would increase rates by 30 to 50% on the backs of the ratepayers, Mr. Speaker. What we are doing, Mr. Speaker, is we have a project that is before us, a project which will mean that energy rates in this province relative to the rest of the country will actually decrease, will actually go down, Mr. Speaker. I said relative to the rest of the provinces, Mr. Speaker, and in fact they will be stable over the long term.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his final supplementary. You know, Mr. Speaker, I think the Premier is making it up as he goes along. You know, Mr. Speaker, the fact is that the Premier has no backup plan for a project that has challenges and is now delayed. Mr. Speaker, we also understand from Newfoundland now that the federal loan guarantee is in question, and that the reason why the loan guarantee is may be in question is because the federal government is concerned about a World Trade Organization challenge under the provisions of subsidies and countervailing measures, and I'll table information on that, which is specifically whether the loan guarantee will be considered a subsidy on the cost of the export power. So, Mr. Speaker, the lack of a loan guarantee would again increase the project cost, yet the NDP have guaranteed that's going to happen. So since the federal government is now saying that it's on hold, will the Premier guarantee to Nova Scotians that this loan guarantee will be signed and approved, and tell us when that will occur?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I can't imagine that the member is serious if he thinks that the federal government is going to release arbitrarily to me the date on which they intend to announce their federal loan guarantee. I can tell them that doesn't happen, and I realize that's all just part of the inexperience of that caucus, of the Leader of the Opposition. They don't really understand, Mr. Speaker, that these agreements are complex, that they require a number of partners working together in order to get something done. The member for Dartmouth East asked for a backup plan. Well, Mr. Speaker, this caucus in electricity and in energy, we have a go-forward plan, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, after 3 years of this government's economic mismanagement, after 3 years of the worst economic growth in Canada, after 3 years of massive, record-breaking deals that saw big checks going to big business, after 3 years we see that Dexter Economics has done nothing to move up wages in Nova Scotia. We have the second lowest wages in Canada. So my question for the Premier, why is his government's economic strategy not seeing wage growth in Nova Scotia?
I would remind all the honourable members, by using a member's name in the House is not permitted. So I just remind the Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is, through good times and bad over the last 20 years, the previous governments have had the worst economic growth in the country, 20 consecutive years. We are finally moving out of that, Mr. Speaker. We have 8,800 more jobs in Nova Scotia today than we had in June of 2009. Job growth is going in the right direction. We have signed the largest industrial contract in the province's history. We have new employers coming into the province. We have young people finally able to get jobs in our province.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I'm trying to get my question, but I can't stop laughing at the Premier. I mean, this is unbelievable. He can't believe that stuff that he ends up saying across Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, we should not be surprised that Nova Scotia wages are the second lowest in Canada after 3 years of the worst economic growth in the country. Making matters worse and holding wages down is this government's habit of doing big deals with big business. This government, Mr. Speaker, agreed to give $590 million to 6 corporations and watched them lay off 1,310 Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I guess, Mr. Speaker, I guess that's what experience gets us, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, 2 million of that, Mr. Speaker, 2 million of that went to Bowater and Port Hawkesbury Paper, companies that slashed wages, rolled back benefits, and left pensioners out in the cold. So my question to the Premier, why is this government choosing to invest in companies that bust unions, drive down wages, and slash benefit packages?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, quite the obvious, and I read the remarks made by the Leader of the Opposition over the past weekend. In fact, the agreements that we have made, for example, with Irving Shipbuilding, which is going to create thousands of jobs, all have job guarantees. They all have targets that they have to meet. So Mr. Speaker, just to give you an example, there is a commercial loan with Irving at a commercial rate, which they can only earn back if they hit, wait for it, job targets, Mr. Speaker. Good-paying jobs, for skilled tradesmen in this province. The young people in our province are going to be able to go to the community college. They're going to be able to get a trade, and they're going to be able to work their lives in that trade, Mr. Speaker, here in Nova Scotia, something that the Liberal Party, when they were in government, were abject failures at.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
On October 16th of this year, the Deputy Minister of Economic Development appeared before the Standing Committee on Economic Development in Nova Scotia, and he said, and I quote, "Basically, our old strategy was, let's be the cheapest producer, and that way we'll compete. That's a race to the bottom, and someone is eventually going to beat you out." End of quote. This government's big deal with big businesses are subsidizing multi-million-dollar corporations to make them cost competitive with markets in developing countries, Mr. Speaker. We will lose that battle too, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, and even if we win this race, as the Deputy Premier says, it is a race to the bottom, with deputy, thank you, Deputy Minister. I appreciate the help. I appreciate the help, Mr. Speaker. A race to the bottom, Mr. Speaker, with lower wages, fewer benefits, and less supports for the middle class. The very kind of deals that this government has been signing and letting workers in the province out on their own, Mr. Speaker. When they sign the check and give it to the company, Nova Scotia workers get a pink slip. So my question to the Premier, why is the Premier placing Nova Scotians in a race to the bottom?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, you know, the Leader of the Opposition has never said what his position is, and that's not surprising. He rarely ever does, or better yet, he takes one position one day and another position the next day, Mr. Speaker. But Mr. Speaker, the question for the Leader of the Opposition is, would he just have walked away from Port Hawkesbury? Would he have just said to all those working people, all those families, all those kids in those communities, would he just have said, "You're on your own"? Is that what he would have done, Mr. Speaker? Would he just said, "You're on your own"? Mr. Speaker, I can tell you this, Mr. Speaker.
Like you did it when you guys.
I'll tell you this, Mr. Speaker. If there is one thing that is certain.
Order, please. Order, please. The Honourable Premier has the floor. And when the Speaker says order, that means order. The Speaker controls the chamber. Okay? Do you get that? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Honourable the Premier.
I can tell you one thing.
Pardon me, hold on. You want to talk, we'll talk after question period. My door is always open, it's downstairs. Honourable the Premier. Hold on. Time. Hold on. I'm not going to ask you one more time, okay? I can hear up here in this chair. That's the last time today. I'm going to look over there and ask you to be silent. Honourable the Premier has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There are 300 people at the Port Hawkesbury paper mill who are working today. There are almost 1,000 people in the Straight-In area who are working today, Mr. Speaker. The one thing that all those people know, Mr. Speaker, is that the one guy you don't want in your corner when you need him is the Leader of the Opposition.
The Honourable Member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Stand up.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday before the UARB, Mr. Antnick of Liberty Consulting said changing the relationship between Nova Scotia Power and the UARB is not up to him or even the UARB. He said it's up to the legislature, Mr. Speaker. He went on to say, in a gas market like this, it's just fundamentally inconsistent to have the province's biggest gas user be housed in the same corporate family as an enterprise that has taken a big stake in the energy business in this part of the world. And I'll table that, Mr. Speaker, as I quote it from it. Mr. Speaker, my question, in light of these most recent concerns about the workings of Emera and Nova Scotia Power, will the Minister of Energy bring in legislation protecting all Nova Scotian ratepayers?
Honourable the Premier. The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the honourable member for the question. Certainly, the UARB has a full responsibility to look at all the costs that are involved here, and you mentioned the Liberty Group as being part of that. That's in the process. They're looking at expertise from all sources. So really, it's the role of the UARB to determine the fairest and just cost for Nova Scotians.
The honourable member for Hants West on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, one of the concerns raised by the Liberty audit is whether this relationship led to higher power bills than necessary. Muskrat Falls is the next biggest project that requires corporate separation between Nova Scotia Power and Emera. The cost of Muskrat Falls is continually going up, as we hear again today. Emera and this government signed a deal without even telling people how much they will have to pay. Mr. Speaker, my question to the minister: will the minister bring forward new legislation to protect ratepayers and provide corporate separation between Emera and Nova Scotia Power before any Muskrat Falls application goes before the UARB?
Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And certainly, again, the UARB has that full and total responsibility to determine what is fair and what is just. If ratepayers have paid too much, the UARB will have that responsibility to indicate that it should be paid back. If they've paid too little, then they'll have to deal with that as well. But that's the full responsibility of the UARB to determine, again, what is fair and just for ratepayers in this province.
The honourable member for Hants West on his final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. All I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, this caucus's #1 priority to protect the ratepayers and protect them in this province. Going forward, Mr. Speaker, the cost of Muskrat Falls is continuing to go up. Mr. Speaker, there's nobody looking out for their best.
Things are becoming a little heated in here, and I'd ask that members take a deep breath so we can continue the debate in the chamber in a nice parliamentary way. I will now recognize the honourable member for Hants West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll start again. Mr. Speaker, the cost of Muskrat Falls is continuing to go up. As we heard today, the estimate has gone up by $1.2 billion, and we know that can continue to rise. Emera gets a guaranteed profit when Nova Scotia Power builds big, expensive projects like Muskrat Falls and charges it back to ratepayers. Nova Scotians are right to worry about their interest, and will they be protected? My question, Mr. Speaker, to the minister: why is the minister continuing to stand with Emera rather than ratepayers when it comes to separating this corporate conflict?
Honourable the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, what I can say is that the Muskrat Falls project will produce the lowest cost energy for Nova Scotians among the options that are there. I would point out, and the member was focused on the question of fuel costs like natural gas, and doesn't seem to understand that there is a difference between the infrastructure, the asset base of the company, and the fuel costs, Mr. Speaker. So Nova Scotia Power, for example, now already owns hydroelectricity dams. They already own coal-fired generating stations, Mr. Speaker. So he misses the fundamental point between fuel and the infrastructure. And the great thing about that project, of course, is that the costs are actually known on the front end. You know, because you know what the financing is for the entire length of the project.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question's for the Minister of Energy. Maybe we'll get some better answers there. As my previous colleague just noted, at the Utility and Review Board hearing yesterday, the Liberty Consulting Group echoed the request that the Liberal caucus made to the board, which was that the Emera and Nova Scotia Power Incorporated have firewalls put between them to prevent any real or potential conflicts of interest in the future. Mr. Speaker, does the minister agree with the Liberty audit and that, or the Liberty comments?
Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the honourable member for the question. Certainly, you know, as I indicated in my answer to the previous member, the role of the UARB is to look at all the options, all the costs here, and make a ruling that's fair and just for all ratepayers. And if it's determined by the board that the Nova Scotia Power is overcharged customers, then we agree that should be paid back, and vice versa if it's not. Again, they'll rule on that decision.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the only person The only people in this legislature that seem not to understand how the Utility and Review Board work are the NDP. The question wasn't about whether the money should be refunded. I agree with the minister that the decision on whether that 10 million or 22 or whatever number it ends up working out to be gets refunded is up to the board. The question which came up yesterday, which Liberty and the board both said was a policy question for this legislature, not them, was whether there should be a firewall between Emera and Nova Scotia Power to prevent future conflicts of interest. And the question is simple. Does the minister agree with that?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, the UARB is a system that was set up under previous governments, and it's a system that looks at all the costs, all the options, and determines what is fair and what is just. And if they determine that Nova Scotia Power is charged too much, it'll be paid back, and if it's not, it will not be. But being open and honest and transparent is important, and the role of the board is to determine what's fair for Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not sure if the minister is not understanding the question or what's going on there, because this is about something which the board and the auditors have all said is a decision for government, not them. You know, this is not about the rate. This is about whether there should be a firewall between Nova Scotia Power and Emera. Liberty in the direct comments, and he can go read the transcript himself, made it very clearly, and the chair of the board agreed yesterday, that it's a policy question. So the question is, and this has happened before, because Emera or Nova Scotia Power was criticized previously when they contracted Emera Utility Services for the Digby Wind Farm for the same problem as a perceived or real conflict. So the question is, does the minister agree there should be a firewall, a legislative or regulatory firewall between Nova Scotia Power and Emera operations? It's a simple question. Does he agree or doesn't he?
The Honourable Minister of Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a simple answer. It's really the job of the UARB to determine these matters. They'll base that on the best evidence that they have, and I'll look forward to their ruling.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you will be to the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, the tragic circumstances around Amanda Todd's death have put the issue of bullying and cyberbullying in the minds of parents and grandparents in Nova Scotia and all across Canada. Last spring, the Minister of Education assured parents that an anti-bullying coordinator would be put in place by September, and I'll table that document. Summer came, Mr. Speaker, and summer went, and there was no announcement made. My question to the Minister is this: why didn't the minister do what she said she would do and put an anti-bullying coordinator in place in time to begin work in September, the beginning of the school year?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Bullying in all of its form, bullying, cyberbullying, is a very complex and a very heartbreaking situation that we are dealing with, not only in Nova Scotia, but across this country. We did name a coordinator, Kathleen Richard, to be our anti-bullying coordinator. She's hit the ground running. She's out in school board. She's working with schools. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton West on his first supplementary.
Thank you very much. And the Minister is quite correct that this is a very serious issue. Serious enough that she had said herself the person should be in place in September, not after that. On April the 27th, 2012, the Minister appeared on CBC's Information Morning to defend criticism from her own task force that her legislation did not go far enough. During that radio interview, the Minister said, and I quote, "So the Justice Department and the anti-bullying coordinator will be working together, and we're going to be liaisoning with stakeholders, police departments. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done, because when we do put legislation forward, we want to make sure that we're considered all the potential implications for that legislation." End of quote. Mr. Speaker, my question is this: will the Minister confirm for this House which specific Justice Department officials and which specific police departments the anti-bullying coordinator has met with to date?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I was very pleased to be at a school just last week, working with the Justice Department, with Kathleen Richard, looking at the framework that's being developed on restorative approaches within our school system, which provides the opportunity for our young people to know how to have respectful conversations and resolve conflict within the school situation. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton West on his final supplementary.
It appears that the minister is quite accomplished at not answering the questions that are being asked. Mr. Speaker, last Sunday, the bullying and cyberbullying was the topic of the popular CBC radio program, Cross Country Checkup. Wayne McKay, the chair of the minister's task force on bullying and cyberbullying, was a guest on that show. As his interview concluded, Professor McKay said, and I quote, "To be fairly brutally honest about this, break my heart might be a bit strong, but I am a bit disappointed that the governments have not reached more forceful and quickly, specifically, I guess, here in Nova Scotia." Professor McKay said, "Governments and others must move quickly to prevent tragedies due to bullying." My question to the minister, when will the minister take the advice of her task force chair? When will she finally move forcefully and quickly to protect kids in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to repeat that this is a very complex issue, and the province has taken a number of approaches. There's many causes for bullying, and we need to get to the root causes. We are moving forward with our action plan. We're working collaboratively with many agencies. This is across government. There needs to be a community response. We need to change the culture in our society to make our people, our children, everyone here having engaged in more respectful conversations. We need to work together to solve this problem. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Colchester North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my question through you is to the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Education's task force on cyberbullying presented their final report in February of this year. This report was a comprehensive review of the state of cyberbullying in this province. The Minister of Education had the opportunity to take the 85 recommendations and create some meaningful legislation that would positively affect the lives of our young Nova Scotians. Instead, Mr. Speaker, she legislated data collection as a means to end cyberbullying through Bill 30 when it was presented in April. Her NDP government then refused to accept the amendments to Bill 30 put forward by the Liberal caucus and supported by the chair of the task force. These amendments were taken directly from the recommendations in the report and could have translated into action. So my question to the minister is this: why did the minister not support amendments taken directly from the recommendations proposed by the Liberal caucus, would have provided action when they were presented?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We have been working very hard at making sure that there are changes within our school system and setting a foundational base as we move forward. Kathleen Richard, our anti-bullying coordinator, is liaisoning with stakeholders, with school boards, with schools, with parents, and we are looking forward to moving forward with our action plan so that we are making sure that we are providing the best supports for students that are in harm's way, providing the ability for students to learn how to have respectful conversations and to resolve conflict within our school situation. I would like to say that this is a community problem, and we need to work together as community to solve the problem. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Colchester North on her first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of those 85 recommendations, which has been mentioned earlier, was to appoint an anti-bullying coordinator. And on March 23rd, the minister said no. In fact, she said, and I will quote, and I will table, We already have people with expertise who can work together on how we can fulfill this mandate without more bureaucracy. However, Mr. Speaker, after pressure from the media, the Liberal caucus, members of the task force, parents and teachers, the minister did a flip-flop and she said she would find a coordinator from within the system. And Mr. Speaker, it took 5 months to find somebody in the system. So my question to the minister is this: how can the minister justify such a delay in responding to the report, delay in hiring the coordinator, delays in implementing recommendations from the task force, when kids in our schools are caught in a web of social media and they are crying out for help?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would like to remind everyone here that schools and school boards have been working diligently on anti-bullying initiatives for many years. We have systems in place in our school already, but we are working on strengthening them and finding other ways and making sure that they're research-based initiatives that are going to affect the change that we need to see in our school. Kathleen Richard has hit the ground running, and she is working with our stakeholders and with our school boards to make sure that what we are providing for our children in our schools are the appropriate measures that we need to have. So thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Colchester North on her final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, this is not a race to see who can get their legislation in first. But I'll tell you what it is, Mr. Speaker. It's a race against time for kids and their parents who are counting on this government for leadership and implementing meaningful anti-bullying policies and action plans that will lead to real change. They do not need any more proof that there is cyberbullying. They do not need any more data collection. They need action. Cyberbullying, Mr. Speaker, can be quiet, a discreet act, and one that a child cannot escape. If the minister, Mr. Speaker, can't be a leader, will she at least be a follower? And will she take the lead from counterparts in other provinces and take this charge and lead it and address the issue before more lives are lost?
Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We stepped up to take the challenge on to make sure that our students in Nova Scotia are safe. The former Minister of Education disregarded the problem that we were having in the school. We've stepped up. We've had a task force. We have good recommendations. We're working with them through our anti-bullying coordinator. This is a very complex issue, and we are working on our action plan. And I want to say that the teachers and the principals and our school staffs are working diligently with our students in our schools to remedy this situation. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is going to be to the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, we've seen the NDP scramble to fix their short-sighted strategy on elementary classroom sizes by hiring 45 teachers, but only after pressure from parents made it impossible for them to do anything else. Adding these teachers a month into the school year was disruptive to children, especially those of the younger grades. Nova Scotia children, parents and teachers deserve to have a government focused on education of our children. So my question is, who are the winners and losers on class sizes? And which schools across the province won the NDP teacher lottery, and which has been left to deal with the high student-teacher ratios alone?
Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We have had the situation of declining enrollment in this province for many, many years. And when September came and we recognized that we had pressures in certain areas, we asked the school boards where those pressures were. We listened. We responded. And, Mr. Speaker, we did not hire 45 new teachers within our system. We hired 73.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton North on his second supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, in a media release on September 27, 2012, the minister is quoted as saying, "I am pleased to announce the government will hire 45 new elementary teachers." Yet last Thursday, October 25, 2012, in question period, less than a month after the previous statement, the same minister said, "We just recently added 73 more teachers so that our children in primary to grade 3 have classroom sizes under 25. Mr. Speaker, which is the truth? Did they hire 45 or fund 73?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I would like just to repeat for the honourable member that we have hired 73 teachers in our system, along with a few schools that have some extra educational assistance support. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Cape Breton North on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, did those 73 teachers come out of the Education Department's budget or existing school departments' budgets? That's what we're asking. Mr. Speaker, our education system has suffered damage during the NDP's mismanagement. We have seen millions removed from the frontline services to our children, yet we have seen last-minute scrambling to adjust some prudent planning with class sizes. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotians deserve better. My question is, will the minister take action now to reassure parents that class sizes will remain appropriate, or will parents have to go through the same sad exercise again next October?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We will be working with the school boards to make sure that we have our lowest class sizes in a generation in our school system. All of our class sizes from primary to grade 3 now, as far as I am understanding from all of the school board, is 25 or fewer. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On March 5, 2010, the Premier promised 500 new jobs in Pictou County. The NDP handed over $60 million to Daewoo Shipping and Marine Engineering and took a 49% stake in the venture. Mr. Speaker, let me quote from the Premier's speech from that day. Quote, "This joint venture will create 120 new jobs in the first year with long-term plans to employ almost 500 people." End quote, and I'll table that, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, $60 million and 2.5 years later, will the Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism tell Nova Scotians when can we expect 500 jobs at DSME Trenton?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think it's probably fair to say that we all want success at DSTN. Mr. Speaker, we made a good investment. We took a facility that was lying idle for years, and we now have people that are working there. Granted, Mr. Speaker, unbeknownst to anyone, the wind energy took a dip. But I can tell you this, Mr. Speaker, we have confidence in DSTN. We are sticking with DSTN. They are going to turn this ship around, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay on his first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, 1 year ago, DSME Trenton came to the Standing Committee on Economic Development, and I asked specifically about market conditions and how they affected their business plan. My specific question, which was one that Nova Scotians are asking across the province, I'll quote, "With 60 million reasons to be concerned, where are the customers? Where are the profits going to come from? The revenues, the profits," end quote, and I'll table that quote. The official from DSME Trenton responded by stating, quote, "Yes, those are certainly the same concerns we have," end quote. We were promised 500 jobs, Mr. Speaker, and when driving by the facility in September, there may be 6 cars in the parking lot. So we're all hopeful that DSME will succeed, but the reality is we have $60 million in taxpayers' money that's been invested there, and we're not even close to the 120 jobs promised in the first year, Mr. Speaker. Why did the Minister and the NDP Cabinet hand over $60 million to taxpayers' dollars without a deep understanding of market fundamentals and the proposed business case for this large corporation?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Nova Scotia is fortunate to have a partner with the caliber and the world respect that DSTN Japan has, Mr. Speaker. We are fortunate. We are fortunate to have that sort of company with a wealth of money. And, Mr. Speaker, as we speak, not only have they developed a marketing strategy, Mr. Speaker, but they are putting that marketing strategy to work, Mr. Speaker, and we are working with them, and we will continue to have confidence in them so that we can realize the jobs for DSTN.
The Honourable Member for Glace Bay on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, quite simply, $60 million were handed over to DSME by this minister and the Premier. 500 jobs were promised, and the minister failed to deliver on that promise. We've taken a 49% liability of the plant with little to no customers. With so much at stake in this deal, it's perplexing as to why the minister would push ahead so aggressively without a clear understanding of what he was getting himself into. And indeed, every single taxpayer in this province has gotten themselves into that through this minister and through the decisions made by economic development. So my question, will the minister table his complete analysis of the markets and business case which led to him to hand over $60 million to DSME with absolutely no job guarantees?
The Honourable Minister of Economic and Rural Development and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I would first like to say it's DSME and Korea, and I think I mistakenly identified Japan. Mr. Speaker, I will reiterate, this is a company with a world-class company, deep pockets, very innovative. Mr. Speaker, we've made investments, and you know, there's some things that happen in the global economy that are unpredictable, out of the reach of many, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we got confidence in DSTN. We've invested in them. We are sticking with them, and we know that they and us together are going to make this work, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Yarmouth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier this year, this government decided to move offices to other locations throughout the province, which seems like an okay idea, except for the fact that it seems to have been mismanaged throughout the entire course of this. The fisheries section of the department is being moved to Cornwallis, but as revealed today on allnovascotia.com, the NDP government is refusing to say how much they will be paying for rent in order to move this department to Cornwallis. So my question to the Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture is, why is the NDP government refusing to release the cost of rent for the departmental move to Cornwallis?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
Thank you very much to the member opposite. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about a move about fisheries and agriculture, because I can clearly point out that both parties over there had an opportunity over the last 3 decades. They failed. We've done more in the last 3 years regarding the fisheries and agriculture than the previous parties have done since the golden time of sale. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Member for Yarmouth on his first supplementary.
We said it's an okay idea to decentralize, but this government hasn't even really done that. They moved like offices from Kentville to New Waterford, and they said it's going to be cost neutral, Mr. Speaker. I will table the comments from the Premier. He said it'd be cost neutral, yet they don't tell us how much these things cost. This is an issue of accountability, openness, and transparency with the public, so I'll ask the Minister again, what is the cost difference for the rent by moving this department to Cornwallis?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure, Mr. Speaker, to see that the member opposite agrees with the move to rural Nova Scotia, something that the two parties over there couldn't accomplish in the last 30 years. What I will say is the cost of this particular building is roughly $250,000 a year. But I'll also add that we're combining other departments, and we're saving $1.5 million from the Department of Natural Resources on our renovations. It's difficult for that member over there to understand, but we're going to create jobs in rural Nova Scotia, which they should have done years ago. Thank you for the question.
The Honourable Member for Yarmouth on his final supplementary.
Speaker, honestly, the only thing I don't understand is if this minister is so confident in this government's management of this process, why can't he tell us what the numbers are? Why can't he tell us? They're hiding it from the public. Mr. Speaker, will the minister and the NDP government be open and transparent with the people and release the information specifically on the rent for this departmental move to Cornwallis?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and to the member opposite. I'm sure that he'll go back and review Hanson, but I'm going to say it again. $250,000 a year on this particular building where we're going to Cornwallis. Also, we're going to save $1.5 million in other departments' renovations. That's something I think everybody in this building understands. We're going to save taxpayer money, and we're going to create jobs in rural Nova Scotia, which they failed to do. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Community Services. Today, Food Banks Canada released their annual Hunger Count survey. Paints a very real picture of families in this province who have fallen on hard times. In the past year, there were over 23,000 people assisted by food banks. Of that, more than a third were children. 7,700 children had to rely on food banks for meals this past year. More than 3,000 new people have had to seek assistance from a food bank since the NDP formed government, and I will table that document. My question to the Minister of Community Services. When the Minister of Finance was jacking up the HST, did the Minister stand up for people using food banks who must use them to make ends meet, or did she toe the party line?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, we realize how difficult it is for Nova Scotians, and we also realize that this is across Canada and throughout the world. And to put this in perspective, we need to look also at the numbers in Alberta that everybody sees as a prosperous province, and their food bank usage went up to 60%, 20% more than Nova Scotia. The reason Nova Scotia's kept at the level is because this government, when we came in, we have in 3 years invested well over $300 million to break the cycle of poverty. We have developed and initiated numerous programs such as the affordable tax credit, the poverty tax credit. We increased the child tax benefit. What did the Conservatives ever do? Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing.
The Honourable Member for Inverness on his first supplementary.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the policies of this government are not working. 3,000 more people using the food bank. And their initiatives are a small consolation. Let's take a look at some of the costs. People who are living on a low income, who it affects them even more. Costs like power bills. They've gone up more than 40%. Up by more than 40% due to this government's energy policy. You can take the HST off all you want, Mr. Speaker, but its cost of energy, power bills are rising. Gasoline prices have increased by over 34%. Food prices have increased by over 9%. Everyone is also paying 2% more HST on almost everything. When her cabinet colleague, the Minister of Energy, told Nova Scotians to bite the bullet and pay more for energy, which they are now doing under this NDP government, did the minister raise her voice for the 7,700 kids who are food bank users, or did she just go along to get along?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, this minister has raised her voice from day one. They were silent for decades. That party was silent. They neglected the most vulnerable in this province, and how dare they even try to pretend that they care about Nova Scotians with the lack. Go look in the history book. You'll see a big zero when it comes to helping people in poverty.
The Honourable Member for Inverness on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, this Progressive Conservative Party understands economics. And we also understand the importance for government to make life more affordable for Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, economics matters just as much for any Nova Scotian. We have the fastest rising prices and the lowest wage growth across the country. Most recent figures show a net loss of 6,300 full-time jobs outside of HRM. This government has killed jobs, it's raised taxes, and implemented expensive policies that families simply cannot afford. Nova Scotians are stretched too thin. My final question to the minister. Will the minister acknowledge her government's wrongdoing and urge her fellow cabinet members to reverse the decisions which have made life more unaffordable for Nova Scotians?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Mr. Speaker, I'll ask the member opposite to ask some people some question. Why doesn't he ask the single parent now, the single parent family that is receiving 30% more income because of this government? Let's ask about the working poor who have 2 children that because of this government has $4,000 more in their pocket each and every year. Let's ask the 249 homeless individuals that now have a place to call home because of this government. If they want me to go on, I can give them lists for hours. If I want to ask them a question, what did they do when they were in? Once again, zero.
The honourable member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Finance. Does she plan to extend the fuel tax exemption that applies to forestry, farming, fishing and manufacturing to the mining industry?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as everyone in this House knows, the mining industry is a very valuable participant in the Nova Scotia economy. Our government has, in fact, initiated a number of really important initiatives to support the mining industry. My department has met with the mining industry, as has the Department of Natural Resources.
Order, please. The time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. I will now recognize the Honourable Government House Leader to call business.
Could you please call government bills for second reading, Mr. Speaker?
Government bills for second reading. The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you please call Bill 94 of the House of Assembly Act?
Bill number 94, the House of Assembly Act. The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, could you tell me how much time I have left, please?
43 minutes, exactly.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, last evening we spoke about the changes that have taken place since this process began over 1 year ago. During that time, we saw a flawed process interfered with by this government that saw the elimination of the protected areas of Clare, Argyll, Richmond and Preston.